Hello everyone, and welcome to Registrar Corp's webinar entitled FDA Food Labeling, the New Normal. My name is Jonathan Rhodes, a marketing specialist at Registrar Corp and today's moderator. This presentation will conclude with a live questions and answers session. If we run out of time, we are also happy to respond to your questions by email. You may submit a written question anytime during the webinar by using the Ask a Question feature in the top center of your webinar screen. A recorded copy of this presentation will be sent to all registrants. I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Anna Benavente holds a Bachelor of Science degree in biology from the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. Ms. Benavente has over 12 years of analytical research experience. As a senior regulatory specialist at Registrar Corp, she has been assisting companies with US FDA regulations since 2009. She has researched thousands of products to determine whether they meet the FDA requirements for compliance. Ms. Benavente is based at Registrar Corp's headquarters in Hampton, Virginia, where she manages a team of 15 regulatory specialists. I'd like to go ahead and begin. Anna?
Thank you, Jonathan, for the kind introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As Jonathan said, I'm Anna Benavente. I'm the director of our Labeling and Ingredient Review Department, and so it's a pleasure to speak to you today and give our presentation on FDA's food labeling. Our plan is to cover the basics of food labeling, also including some of the dramatic changes that have recently come into effect. So food labeling requirements. What must appear on my food label? Every food exporter and importer should be asking themselves this question before they start the process. And while I'm certain that there's a lot of things that exporters and importers have to consider from supply chains and finances and so forth, this is a very important question. About a third of all detentions in the US by FDA are labeling related. And it's often a case of companies being unaware of what the requirements are. So we'll be going over what are, generally speaking, the mandatory requirements for retail, conventional food, and beverage labeling. And so these are the basic elements that should appear on the labels of products that are sent to the United States. And so we'll go through the basic requirements of each one of these today. First and foremost, it's important to understand two very basic labeling terms that are used by FDA. So FDA's requirements often include specific placement of information, and they use the terms principal display panel and information panel when describing this placement. The principal display panel, or as we say, the PDP, is the panel that is most likely to be displayed on a retail shelf. So you can kind of see from the picture here, in a box or a carton, it might be that front panel. On a can, it'll be the front part of the cylinder. If you have more unusually shaped product containers, like for example, maybe a brie, it might be the top of the brie. So whatever a consumer will first see when they're purchasing your product at the store. Then you have the information panel. The information panel is the panel that is immediately to the right of the PDP, unless that panel is unusable. For example, if it has flaps or has a container shape that doesn't allow for labeling information to be presented there. There are some exemptions for smaller packaging to the information panel placement, but generally speaking, again, the panel that's to the right of the PDP. Now, the first and most important element that will be presented on that PDP is what we call the Statement of Identity. This is, in essence, what the product is, and it must be the name specified by law, or if there is none, what's called the common or usual name. So that would be the name that's just generally used by the general public for that type of product. Or if there's no common name, a fanciful name that would also be understood by the general public. So for example, most of us are familiar with Oreos, When I say an Oreo, you know what I'm talking about, but that's not a statement of identity. And if you look on an Oreo package, you'll see in very small print, there's an additional statement, something like chocolate sandwich cookies, something that will describe to the consumer what the product is. It needs to be the common or usual name and truthful and not misleading. Now, also important to understand that statements of identity may also be subject to what is called a standard of identity. And we'll get into that on the next slide. Now, generally speaking, this statement of identity placed on the PDP and by regulation must be in a size reasonably related to the largest text on the label. The regulation does not state what's meant by reasonably related. However, FDA guidance documents state that they consider half the size of the largest text on the label to be reasonably related. Now, this is a guidance, it's not in regulation, but it's often good to go ahead and adhere to that anyway. So a standard of identity is established in cases where FDA wants to ensure that a product is what a consumer expects it to be. And it establishes specific requirements for a food to be called by a certain name. This may describe ingredients that may be added or manufacturing processes that must be followed. So it also may describe certain specifications that must be met. So for example, products like ice cream and peanut butter and cheese are subject to standards of identity. So for example, cheese and ice cream might have milk fat percentages. Other ingredients may be allowed or specifically prohibited from being incorporated in order to adhere to the standard. So here are some examples. You can kind of see we've got ice cream, Breyer's ice cream up there in the left-hand corner. Again, the ice cream standard specifies what ingredients can be included and as well as the manufacturing process. Products like jams, jellies, and preserves are also subject to it, to a standard. Mixed nuts, you'll notice the Planters mixed nuts also specifies the amount of peanuts. All of that is written into regulation. And then margarine actually is also subject to a standard of identity, which details what ingredients may be included, as well as the addition of vitamin A and D. So if a product is similar to a product that has a standard but doesn't meet it, then it will have to be called something else. It doesn't mean you can't market it, but for example, you might not be able to call it ice cream. Now, when you look in the marketplace in the United States, you'll actually see this fairly commonly. If you go to the frozen food section in a local grocery store, you'll see products that are labeled as ice cream. And right next to them will be a product that looks very similar, but it might be called a frozen dairy dessert. This is an example of a product that doesn't meet the standard for ice cream, but still can be legally marketed in the United States. For example, for products that don't meet the jam standard, they might be called fruit spreads. Those that don't meet the margarine standard might be called something like a vegetable oil spread, and so forth. Now, also appearing on the PDP will be a net quantity of contents statement. So this is the amount of product in the container. It should be in terms of weight for solid products, numerical count, or liquid measure for liquids. Importantly, it needs to include both the avoirdupois and the metric measure. So ounces as well as grams, fluid ounces as well as milliliters or liters. It's important that you have both, and this is a common issue with products coming into the United States. Also important to know, it must appear in a minimum type size based on the size of the PDP. So FDA has established minimum type size requirements based on how big that PDP is. The larger the PDP, the larger that net quantity of content statement is. For solid products using ounce, gram, kilogram, you must include net weight or the abbreviation for it. There's an optional net or net content statement for liquid measure, but not required. It also has specific placement requirements. It'll need to be in the bottom third of the PDP. The FDA has established all this so that a consumer can easily compare products and determine how much product they're getting for their money, which of course for all of us makes perfect sense. Now we'll go ahead and move on over to the information panel. So importantly on the information panel will be a statement of the ingredients. FDA has very strict rules regarding how these have to be declared. Again, it's all about consumers being aware of what's in the product. Ultimately, I think it's helpful to remember that FDA, while they're very concerned with food safety, they're also worried about consumer fraud. And they want to make sure that consumers can have access to truthful and specific information about the products they buy. And ingredients are a very important part of this. So every ingredient should be declared by its common or usual name. So for example, you can't use E-numbers for your food additives on labels for products intended for the United States. You'll have to name your emulsifiers and your preservatives, your stabilizers. You can't simply list the function of the ingredient. Something like permitted colors is not allowed. They also have to be in descending order by weight. Multi-component ingredients must declare the sub-ingredients in parentheses next to the name of the ingredient. So for example, margarine is comprised of a number of ingredients. Those should be declared in parentheses next to the declaration of margarine in the ingredients list. Also importantly, most ingredients can't be grouped together. So it's very common, for example, in other areas of the world where you might group your colors together, you might group a blend of sweeteners or fruits together. This can't really be done in the United States. Only a few categories of ingredients, like leavening agents, can be grouped together. You'll need to figure out where those individual ingredients should appear in the list when properly ordered in descending order by weight. There are also some additional requirements for colors and flavors, where any color that's added should be considered artificial color and declared as such, or by name with a descriptor that it is a color. Certain colors like the F, D, and C colors must be named that way. And for example, flavors have to be specified as natural or artificial. FDA doesn't recognize the term nature identical. Those would be considered artificial flavors. Also, extremely important matter would be checking out the FDA's food additive regulations that it pertain to your product. This is a very common issue. FDA regulates ingredients in a very different way than in other areas of the world. And so you want to make sure, you absolutely should verify that your ingredients are permitted here. Colors especially can present a problem, as FDA specifically approves colors for addition to food. We also have an allergen statement requirement from the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act. And in it, it states that food labels should declare any ingredient that is what they deem a major food allergen or that contains a protein derived from a major food allergen on the label. There are two different ways that you may do this. You can either indicate it in the ingredients list. For example, you might specify that it's wheat flour instead of just calling it flour. Or you can have a separate statement that says contains and then lists the allergens and place this adjacent to the ingredient list. It's important to know if you choose to use the contains option that you include every allergen in it. So for example, you would not be okay to put wheat flour in the ingredients list, and then because your lecithin is derived from soy, just put contains soy underneath it. FDA would fear that a consumer allergic to wheat would see contains soy and then be unaware that wheat is present. So you'll want to complete contains with every allergen listed. Now, there are only certain allergens, though, that need to be listed. So your allergen statement is going to include any declaration for these allergens: milk, eggs, fish, crustaceans, shellfish, tree nuts, peanuts, wheat, and soybeans. And then again, any ingredient that contains a protein derived from a major food allergen. Recently, just within the last month or two, there was a publication from FDA that they are allowing now a new voluntary disclosure of sesame. And they're actually encouraging companies to declare it if it's present in the product. Now, if you have allergens like, for example, sulfites or rye that are not on this list, you should not include them in the contained statement. I know it seems like it really doesn't make too much sense, but FDA wants that statement to be limited only to these major food allergens. And amazingly, we actually see companies get in trouble for this. We have seen warning letters for companies that put contains rye on their labeling, and FDA deemed that inappropriate since rye is not one of these major food allergens. So again, limit it to this and then add in sesame if it's present in your product. Now, next statement that you're going to have to ensure is present: the declaration of the manufacturer, packer, or distributor. The regulations only require that one be named. So depending on who uses your label and how your product is marketed and manufactured, any one of those three, whichever serves you best, will be fine. Important though, that if it's a distributor or a packer named on the label, that you include a qualifying phrase, such as manufactured for, distributed by. This will alert FDA that that entity is not the actual manufacturer. You also need to include the corporate name and address. So a trade name, an abbreviation, doesn't meet the requirements of the regulation. So make sure you've got that LLC, that SA to CV, whatever it happens to be, the full corporate name. Also, the full address must be given, so no PO boxes. FDA wants to be able to find the manufacturer or distributor of a product if there's a problem, but the street address can be omitted if it is found in a local directory. Next up is not an FDA requirement, but we reference it anyway because it's important that it be named on the label, and this would be the country of origin statement. This statement is required by U.S. Customs and Border Protection on articles of foreign origin entering the United States. This must be in English. We also recommend that it be clearly stated and not necessarily just incorporated into a symbol or anything like that. It's also the country where the last quote-unquote substantial transformation took place. So for example, if you are in Italy and you are importing raw materials into Italy, but then actually manufacturing the product in Italy, Italy, generally speaking, is the country of origin. You won't need to name where all the raw materials are sourced from. Also importantly, because Customs wants to be sure that the consumer has an accurate representation of the country of origin, is that it should be placed near any reference to a country that is not the country of origin. So for example, if you're naming a US distributor, but the product is made somewhere else, the country of origin should be right next to it if possible. Also, if you have any sort of representation, for example, if you're manufacturing croissants in Canada, if you have a French flag on your packaging, best thing to do is to go ahead and put that country of origin in close proximity to that. That way, an American consumer is not going to mistakenly think that the product is manufactured in France. Now, we get a lot of questions about additional languages. Of course, in many parts of the world, it is required to have more than one language on your labeling. In the United States, the only requirement is that all mandatory information must be declared in English. Now, the important thing, though, is that if there is an additional language represented, then all mandatory statements should be presented in that language. FDA's rationale for this is that there are a fair number of American consumers who don't speak English, and if they are presented with a label, for example, that maybe has some statements in Spanish that they understand and tell them, what the product is, then they need to be able to access all the other mandatory statements in that language that FDA considers important and appropriate for a consumer to have. Now, certain things are exempted from this. So, for example, brand names or mottos, product names like spaghetti that don't have an English equivalent are typically exempt. So if you put, magnifique on your muffin label, you don't have to repeat everything in French. They're really looking towards foreign language declarations that provide substantial information about the product. Again, wanting an American consumer that doesn't speak English to then have access to all the other information that is necessary. Now, recently, the U.S. Department of Agriculture established a list of foods that tend to be bioengineered or GMO. And they put in some requirements for disclosure of this fact on food labels. So certain products containing these foods must disclose the presence of bioengineering on the label. And there are several options. Most notably, you can see the symbol down there in the bottom right corner that the product contains a bioengineered ingredient. The list only has a handful of things on it, like corns on it, soybeans, genetically engineered salmon, a few other things. But it is important to know that if a company has actual knowledge that the food is bioengineered or contains a bioengineered ingredient, then it must disclose it on the label. For example, that symbol, usually we've been placing it on the the information panel. The requirement comes into full effect on January 1st, 2022, but we've gone ahead and started adding this to the labels that my department reviews and modifies, just to go ahead and get it on there and get that ball rolling so you're not caught unawares when the deadline passes. Another common claim, again, USDA regulated, but applies to foods under FDA jurisdiction, are organic claims, particularly in our marketplace now. Organic is a big marketing advantage. A lot of consumers are interested in clean living, clean eating, and so an organic claim, if a product qualifies, can certainly be a boon from a marketing standpoint. Important to know, however, that for foods, it requires certification by a USDA-recognized agent unless a memorandum of understanding exists. So, for example, our USDA has an MOU with Europe, with the European Union, that products that are certified organic there can make the organic claim over here. USDA's rules also break it down by the percent of organic ingredients to determine what you can claim. So excluding water or salt, if it's 100% organic, then of course you can claim that. 95% or above, you can claim organic and also use the seal. Those between 70 and 95 can add the claim of made with organic and then include those ingredients. And then if you're less than 70%, you may only disclose the individual organic ingredients in the ingredients list. Now, I mentioned earlier that there have been some dramatic changes recently in food labeling that have been implemented by FDA. And so we've kind of saved the best for last, the new nutrition facts label. And how must nutritional information be declared now? Now, most people by now are aware of the new FDA rules for nutrition labeling, but may not have investigated further. So we're going to go through kind of all these changes because it's important to become aware. Now, these really are monumental changes, not even exaggerating, for the benefit of this webinar. They're pretty monumental and groundbreaking. And FDA passed final rules in May 2016 to dramatically change how this information is to be presented. They initially established compliance dates in about 2018 and 2019. Those were extended, but now both have passed. So companies with annual global food sales of greater than $10 million had to comply by January 1st. Companies with annual food sales less than $10 million had to comply by the first part of January of this year. So some of you may be familiar with the old nutrition facts panel. You can kind of see an example here. And this has appeared on our food packaging for the past 30 years. It is no more, however. It's been replaced with a new version that more adequately reflects new research and nutritional data. In determining what changes would be made, FDA did an exhaustive survey of nutritional needs and deficiencies in the American diet. They looked at how consumers read nutrition labeling and what sort of changes they felt were necessary to help make American consumers more aware of the nutrient value of the foods that they consume. So it is critical that all companies that market food products in the US implement these changes now. Got to avoid detention and refusal of goods as these compliance dates have passed. FDA will give a bit of a grace period, we imagine, but we anticipate that they will start enforcing this in the coming months. Now, there's some significant changes to the content of the nutrition facts chart. It's important to understand this because it's not just a matter of taking the old chart and then changing some type sizes, moving things around. It reflects new concerns about the American diet and the nutritional deficiencies that they found. So, for example, vitamin D and potassium are now mandatory declarations for the label. So if you don't know the vitamin D and potassium content of your food, you're going to need to find out because that needs to be declared. Vitamins A and C, FDA determined, now they can be voluntary. They aren't really of significant concern in the US diet anymore, and so their declarations are no longer mandatory. Similarly, calories from fat may no longer be declared at all. New research suggests that it's the type of fat that's more important than the amount of calories from fat. Fluoride is also now a voluntary declaration, and sugars is now being declared as total sugars. And this would be the free mono and disaccharides found in the food product. Now, part of the change to total sugars is because there's a new declaration, added sugars, that must be declared when they're present at certain amounts. So an added sugar would be a sugar specifically added, usually for sweetening, but again, distinct from the total sugars. So for example, milk might have a total sugars amount due to the lactose, but there's no free or monodisaccharides being added. So milk won't have an added sugars declaration, but it will have a total sugars declaration. Also, quantitative amounts for the 4 mandatory vitamins and minerals must be given. Before, we just declared percentages, and that was pretty much it. There are new methods, actually, for determining vitamin A and E values. Also, folate and folic acid are considered separate declarations, and there's a new calculation for how to determine those. And then some new units for declaring vitamin D, niacin, vitamin A, and vitamin E. They've made some other changes, a more restrictive definition for dietary fiber, for example, where FDA expects only those fibers that have proven beneficial value to human health be declared. They've changed the daily reference values and the recommended daily intake values for certain nutrients. And this is what the percent daily value is based on. So it's important to use those new values. Some of them are quite different. For example, potassium went from 3,500 milligrams to 4,700 milligrams. So that's clearly going to have a huge impact on the percent of potassium declared on the label. FDA also surveyed the manner in which US consumers eat and the amount that they eat. So these serving sizes that they've established for some foods have changed. So for example, beverages, ice cream, appetizers, and candy all those serving sizes changed with the rules in 2016. Now, the formatting also changed, again, reflecting FDA's review of scientific and nutritional data as well as consumer eating habits. So they've changed, for example, the order of nutrients. They've changed the footnote. Basically, they got rid of the huge chart that used to be at the bottom, which is nice if you're trying to fit this on your label, and then explained in better terms what 2,000 calories a day represents. They changed the font sizes. You can see the calorie count is now the largest text in this panel. And that was important because Americans oftentimes aren't really aware of the amount of calories we consume in a day. You know, I don't think it's any secret that overweight and obesity is an issue in the United States. And so FDA wanted to make sure that the calorie count was front and center and very easily picked up on by a consumer. And then you can see down there at the bottom, for example, all of those quantitative amounts are declared, not just the percentages. Now, there are other versions of the Nutrition Facts panel that anybody who's looked at food labeling in the US is probably aware. We have what we call our Simplified panel. And so FDA retained this with the 2016 rules. And so this particular chart is permitted when a product meets certain FDA requirements related to nutritional content, or basically a lack of nutritional content. So for example, sodas, olive oils, simple candies won't have that much in the way of the number of nutrients present. So FDA will allow you to use these abbreviated charts that declare a few mandatory nutrients and then anything else that might be present in the product. We also have what we call our tabular label. And so these were also changed in formatting. There are two different versions. There's the smaller version that you see up top for smaller packaging. In essence, less than 40 square inches of labeling space, you may qualify for this tabular version. For products that are bigger than that have more labeling space, but aren't very high on that information panel, less than 3 inches, you can use this version. I call it the pizza box version. The one on the bottom is for larger packaging, but without much height on that info panel. So you can use this version of the tabular chart so that it can fit. We also have the linear panel, which is permitted when a tabular panel will not fit on product packaging. So for example, small packages of gum or mints might qualify for this linear label. It's important to understand that it can only be used if the tabular does not fit. We strongly recommend that you try and get that tabular on there, and only if it doesn't fit, go ahead and resort to using the linear label. Now there's a new twist to the nutrition labeling rules, dual column labeling. It used to be that we had dual column labeling. Generally speaking, it was voluntary. It was used mostly for unprepared products like cake mixes, where you might want to declare the amount once it's prepared. Also, products like cereal, if they wanted to declare the amount once a half a cup of milk was added, it allowed for a second column for this purpose. New twist now, though, because FDA has mandated dual column labels for certain products. And so it's usually going to be based on the FDA's reference amount customarily consumed for that food, which is the reference amount that FDA found that people normally consume in one sitting. And this is the basis for the serving size in our nutrition labelings. So if for products, for example, that are in packaging that is 200 to 300% of that rack value, they will have to have a dual column label. Also for products that are in discrete units that are 200 to 300% of that reference amount. So these are two examples, and they're designed to force Americans to realize how much we're consuming. We have kind of a slight issue with portion control in the US diet, and so this makes sure that a consumer is aware. So for example, on the left-hand side could be a snack bag of chips, something that can be eaten in one sitting, but if it's between 200 and 300% of that rack value, it needs to have that per container declaration. So if I'm sitting and watching TV and, just got a bag of chips open, I'm gonna know if I eat the whole thing, exactly how much I'm consuming. Again, designed to try and help Americans make smarter eating choices. The example on the right-hand side is based on a unit. So for example, those awesome Otis Spunkmeyer muffins, they're so delicious, but they're also about the size of your head. And so in cases like that, where that unit, that muffin, is between 200 to 300% of the normal serving size for a muffin, it's going to have that dual column. So when I eat the whole thing, I know that I'm consuming 760 calories, and I can factor that into the amount of food that I consume for the remainder of the day. Okay, so now as we kind of wrap up and get to the questions, I'd like to sort of touch on some of the common mistakes that we encounter with labeling issues and some other things. We assist about 18,000 companies that market food in the United States. And so they come to us with a lot of FDA issues or detentions. And this is the most frequent mistakes that we see. So for example, perhaps the name of the food doesn't conform to FDA's requirements. And this can happen for a lot of different reasons. So for example, maybe the common or usual name is not being used. For example, maybe it says Oreo, but it doesn't have the chocolate sandwich cookie declaration so that somebody actually knows what it is. There are also some requirements for certain ingredients be specified in the statement of identity. So if you have a strawberry candy that has artificial flavor added to it, it's going to need to say strawberry flavored candy, and artificial needs to be added. You might have, again, a product that has a standard of identity, and perhaps it doesn't meet that standard of identity, so it would need to be renamed. There are a lot of different ways that the name of a food can be deemed misleading and insufficient by FDA. Now, it's possible, and this is really, really common, that the net quantity statements don't include the ounce and pound declarations or fluid ounce, pint, and quart. Even though we made the shift over to metric many, many, many years ago, most Americans still tend to think of amounts in terms of ounce and fluid ounce. And so this needs to be added to the labeling. You do not want to send a product that only has the amount in grams or milliliters or kilograms. Please make sure that both are present. Again, another common issue, incomplete bilingual or multilingual labeling. It's very common, for example, from the EU, you'll see 3, 4, 5, 6 different languages present because of the nature of the EU. But here, those would require that the nutrition facts chart and everything else be translated into each one of those languages. Now, our nutrition facts chart is pretty complex, and there are a lot of different rules that dictate what is and is not put into the nutrition facts panel. So it's quite common for people to try to get that information on there, but do it incorrectly. Or they may only have the nutrition facts panel in English, even though other languages are present. This is pretty common. Oftentimes we get asked, if I have the nutrition facts panel in English, can I have the nutrition chart for my home country in a different language? And the answer is no. You need to translate that entire nutrition facts panel into any other language that's on your labeling. We also see that a lot of times it's because they want to include the per 100 gram or 100 milliliter declaration that's required in their home country. And you can do that. For the dual column, it does allow you to add per 100 grams or 100 milliliters. So in this particular case, you would have the FDA serving size for that food, followed by a column with per 100 grams or 100 milliliters. Now, it's also important that you figure out what that FDA serving size is. It varies widely depending on the type of food. So, for example, for beverages, there are two main reference amounts. For coffee, tea, carbonated beverages, it's 360 milliliters. For milk and fruit-based drinks, it's 240. You want to make sure that serving size is correct. And then lastly on our list, ingredients declared using the E numbers, INS numbers. For cosmetics, we see CI numbers. These aren't going to meet the FDA's requirements for the common or usual name. So you'll need to update those to show exactly what the ingredient is. Americans don't use E numbers. So please make sure that all your ingredients are declared using that common or usual name. Now the question next is, how can Registrar Corp help? So you can get assistance from the labeling experts in my department and elsewhere in the company. So we do free label assessments. If you visit our website at that address, you can learn if your current labeling meets U.S. requirements at no cost. I spend a good part of my day doing this, actually. Companies will send us the labels, we'll take a look at them, and then let them know if we think that there are some significant compliance concerns. I'll let you know exactly kind of what those are. Maybe it's a case of the net quantity statement missing mandatory information. Maybe it's a case the ingredients don't appear to have all the common names. We'll give that to you for no additional cost. Now, if you need a more in-depth review and you want to make sure that we've covered every single aspect of your labeling, and you'd like us to go ahead and modify your label so that it's compliant, we have a labeling review service. We have graphic designers who are trained to make sure that the labeling meets all of the requirements at the direction of the regulatory specialists in my group that will research all the labeling regulations that pertain to your product. And then we will provide you with a graphic file that you can print and use, and that way you know when you ship that your product, if inspected, will pass muster. The FDA won't find any sort of compliance issues with the labeling. If they question anything that's on the label and you're using the label we provided, we will intercede on your behalf for no additional charge. We will interact with FDA, we will explain what labeling regulations were used to develop that label and explain the rationale behind our assertion that it's compliant. Again, we would do that at absolutely no charge if you run into an FDA issue with our revised label. We also have other solutions for typical compliance matters related to FDA. Important to note that they are fixed fees. You will not be charged by the hour. You will know at the front end exactly what our services will cost. We have services related to, I would say, most of the FDA requirements for food. So registration, the U.S. agent requirement. Companies are required to have a U.S. agent if they are foreign and not located in the United States. We serve that purpose for 18, 20,000 companies or more. We do what's called prior notice, where you are required to notify FDA specifically of food shipments that are coming to the U.S. Again, the product and labeling review service. Also, if you have an acidified or a low acid canned food, we can assist with those filings. We also have on our website really cool free wizards, FCE wizard, to help you determine if your product is required to meet these regulations specified by FDA. And we also have a way for you to verify the submission identifier of a particular food that would have been submitted to FDA. We have an incredible food safety group that will help with food safety and FSMA, also with the FSVP requirements for importers. We assist with detentions. We have a lot of experience helping companies that have run into a problem in port with FDA. We may be able to help you get the products released, but at a minimum, you should come to us because we can help you figure out what's happening. If FDA has issued a notice of action, we can help you decipher it and figure out, is this a problem that can be fixed, and how would I go about doing that? We do this for free as well. If you reach out to us, we'll take a look at that notice and we can let you know how, generally speaking, you might be able to solve this problem. The FDA also has import alerts. Companies that are listed as being detained without physical examination, we can potentially help you get off an import alert by petitioning FDA on your behalf. So we have services related to that as well. Now, I'd like to go ahead and I can move on over to the question and answer session. So I'll go ahead and answer as many questions as I can. If we run out of time, then I can go ahead and you're welcome to go ahead and send your questions to info@registrarcorp.com, and we'll be happy to answer them then as well. Go ahead and start with the first question. Could you send the webinar presentation by email? We absolutely will be doing this. You will get, there'll be a link actually at the conclusion of the webinar, and we'll be sending it out to everybody who attended as well. Let's see, there's a question about raw material food ingredients, like fruit pulps that are used as raw material for beverages by manufacturers in the United States. So if you're sending a raw material, the labeling requirements are not nearly as stringent. So you would still want to label it with, for example, the statement of identity. If it has multiple ingredients, name those, name the manufacturer, packer, or distributor, name the country of origin. You do not need to worry, though, about the nutrition facts panel. That is only for retail products. Okay? And you want to make sure that you label it clearly. Unlabeled products often get detained. Also, sometimes I think people are under the assumption that they can send, unlabeled cans maybe to their distributor, have the distributor add the label. The problem with this is that FDA import has no assurances that that is what is going to happen. So absolutely, whenever possible, label those products before you ship them into the United States. Let's see. Question, could you explain how to declare flavorings again? How much of flavorings can you group together? Okay, good question. So for flavors, FDA does recognize that oftentimes these are, multi-ingredient components, and they do permit a simple declaration of natural flavor or artificial flavor. So again, a natural flavor would be one that's derived from the actual ingredient whose flavor it purports to represent. Artificial or nature identical flavors would be those that are kind of created in a lab, synthesized. When you declare, this is very important, when you declare that flavor in the name of the product, or for example, if it's candy and you have pictures of strawberries all over the label, if it doesn't contain actual strawberries, you need to put either naturally flavored and flavored. If it's naturally flavored, if it's artificially flavored, you must declare that it is artificially flavored. This is a common problem. You want to make sure that that is there. Now, if there's no flavor declaration on, in the product name, and you have an artificial flavor added, then you're not required to actually include artificially flavored. Okay, the next question. If the distributor doesn't want to disclose the manufacturer, can we only put distributed by? Answer to that is yes. This is fairly common, particularly if you have a brand owner that has multiple manufacturers and they don't want to have a different label for each manufacturer. It is perfectly okay to go ahead and put just the distributor's name. Just be sure that you have that qualifying phrase, distributed by or manufactured for, or something to describe that company's relationship to the product. Okay, next question. If the company has a registered DBA name, can we specify that the honey is packed under the DBA they're doing business as? You can add the DBA name, but you still must have the actual corporate name for the entity. So please, include the corporate name, DBA as, Super Awesome Honey, or whatever the name might be, include the corporate name as well. Okay, next question. A honey sample is packed in a small jar. Must it have a nutritional label? So if your product label is so small that the linear version won't fit, if it is below 12 square inches of labeling space, now bear in mind that's labeling space, not the size of the label. But if the container itself has less than 12 square inches of labeling space, you are permitted to just include a phone number where a consumer can obtain the nutritional information. Okay, next question. Can you sell organic products with a European organic claim in the USA? If the product is manufactured in the EU and is certified appropriately in the EU, it will likely come under that memorandum of understanding and can be marketed as organic in the United States. Let's see. Next question. If an ingredient is a sub-ingredient of more than one major ingredient, should it be mentioned as a total or after every major ingredient? Excellent question. So you might have a case where, for example, water is a sub-ingredient of more than one of the major ingredients. And there's two different ways you can do this. Because if you declare the sub-ingredients after the major ingredient, you need to include them all. So you could either put water after each one of those major ingredients. Now, if you don't mind doing a little bit of math, however, maybe you can go ahead and figure out exactly the percent of each of the sub-ingredients in each one of those ingredients, and then compile one master list. So maybe then water, for example, becomes number one on the list, and that includes the amount of water in each ingredient. So it's going to require, doing some math, maybe being really good with Excel, but you can break up those sub-ingredients and then just declare them in the ingredients list. Now, another question about ingredients. In the ingredient declaration, is the physical state declared? For example, garlic powder or just garlic? Generally speaking, if you have an ingredient where there are different forms, for example, you could have kind of whole garlic, but then also dehydrated garlic powder, we recommend including that physical state if it provides more information about the ingredient. Okay. Next question. Are alcoholic beverages an exception to the nutrition labeling obligation? Good question. Alcoholic beverages are mostly regulated by a different agency in the US, and they do not have this nutrition labeling. It's called TTB, Alcohol Tax and Trade Bureau. They oversee distilled spirits, most normal, quote unquote, normal beers that are made with barley and hops, and wines that are greater than 7% alcohol. If you have a wine that is less than 7%, or a beer that's made with really unusual ingredients or no hops, those will be FDA regulated. And so if you have a particular product and you're curious whether it's FDA or TTB, send it to us. We can tell you usually pretty quickly whether it will be regulated or the labeling will be regulated by FDA or TTB. So please do send those to us. Happy to help and make it clear which agency you should be concerned with. Okay, so I have a question about adding nutritional panel to HoReCa labels. I'm not familiar with what that is, so the best thing you can do is send those labels for the free assessment, and we can tell you whether or not you'd be required to have nutrition panels. Okay, another good question. Do I need to add vitamin D or potassium even if I don't have those elements in my product? No. So it's not a requirement when we say mandatory. It is not a requirement that those be present. Only that if they are present, you have to declare those amounts in the label. So for example, if you have olive oil, which does not have vitamin D and potassium, then you would not declare those amounts. You would leave them at 0. Or if it's olive oil, you would use the Simplified chart, which allows you not to declare vitamin D and potassium in the chart at all. And again, we can help you understand when you qualify for the Simplified version of the FDA chart as part of our label review service. Okay. Another question, does the new nutritional information apply to animal feeds? No. So animal feeds are under a different set of regulations. FDA has talked about adding some sort of a chart. Right now, most animal feeds have what's called guaranteed analysis, which is described by what's called the Association of American Feed Control Officials, but it is not an FDA requirement. So animal feeds would not have a nutrition facts panel. Okay. Let's see. Next question, is it correct if the label is in English and French and the panel nutrition facts is only in English? Unfortunately, no. If you have significant product information like the product name or ingredients in French as well as English, you need to have the nutritional panel in French as well. Okay. Another question, the FDA serving size for snacks. The basic serving size for snacks are 30 grams. And so you would then declare the amount that's closest to 30 grams that actually fits a common household measure. So FDA wants it to be in tablespoons or cups, or the actual unit of the snack. And so you would declare that amount that's closest to 30 grams. Let's see, we have a question about presentation related to feed labeling. At this point, we don't have a presentation related to feed labeling, but that's a great idea, and I'm going to suggest it. We do animal feed labels in the product and ingredient review department that I oversee. We do everything from feeds for livestock to pet foods for dogs and cats and everything in between. And so we can advise you regarding the labeling requirements for animal feed and pet food. Let's see. Okay, so hello, we recently updated our honey labels for products going to the US. We were told that we have to add a line of added sugars, as honey is an ingredient. But do we need to write on the right of the line 34%? Why is this? So this is a really complicated matter, and FDA has been going back and forth with the honey and the maple syrup producers about this. Honey and maple syrup are considered added sugars because added sugars is talking about sugars added to the diet, not to the product itself necessarily. The problem is with honey and maple syrup that a consumer could see added sugars and think that the honey or the syrup is adulterated and that regular sugar is being added to the product. So FDA and the honey and maple syrup industry have been going back and forth regarding what is an appropriate way to present this information. And so if you actually reach out to us directly, it's too complicated to try and give quickly in a Q&A session, but we're happy to present the information that FDA has published about how to declare added sugars for honey and similar products. Okay. Let's see, so another question, if a product contains 8 servings, must we label with a dual column nutrition value table? Generally speaking, no. It would be if you're between 2 and 3 servings in that packaging, then you would have the dual column. Okay, I'm going to find another question. Is there a recycling logo in the USA like in Europe? So recycling logos aren't FDA regulated. Of course, a lot of companies go ahead and have that as part of the packaging. And as a person who recycles, I appreciate it very much. But it's not an actual required statement the way it may be elsewhere. Okay, some other questions about the presentation. We will be sending this out. Again, we have a lot of questions and unfortunately are running out of time. So, if I don't get to your question, please do email us. We'll be absolutely happy to follow up with you and answer any questions that you might have. Let's see, question, do you do just US labeling? We actually have ventured into Canadian labeling as well. So if you are interested in product labels for Canada, we may be able to assist. A question regarding if your label overstates nutritional factors such as cholesterol. So FDA has some, because they understand manufacturing processes can differ and sometimes products might not have the exact amount of the nutrient that's declared in the chart, they have some allowances for that. And generally speaking, they're mostly concerned about understating what might be deemed an unhealthy nutrient like cholesterol versus overstating it. So if you understate cholesterol, then it can be a problem. If you understate total fat, or for something that's a healthy nutrient like potassium, if you overstate the amount of potassium, then that's going to be more of a concern than understating the level of potassium. Okay, we'll have time for maybe one more question. Let's see. Question, if there are any specific labeling requirements for foreign suppliers. So foreign suppliers are subject to the same requirements as a US-based company. Any product sold in the United States, whether it comes from abroad or if it's manufactured here, must bear all these mandatory statements. So it's important that you know this before you ship, because getting stopped in port with labeling that is not compliant is a real problem. And we do a lot of work with companies that have done just that have run into a detention, have to relabel the product in port. So we just wrapped one of these up actually last week, had to create a new label. We had to petition FDA to allow the company to relabel the product. It's not an overly complicated matter, but it takes a long time. It's important to know FDA works on its own timeline. So even after we submitted the request and the petition to relabel, it took weeks to get an answer from FDA. And especially if your product has a short shelf life, or might spoil in port, or is frozen or refrigerated and you're paying to have it stored while you go through this process, it can be a very expensive mistake. So, I'll go ahead and just sort of sum up and recommend strongly that you do an analysis of your products, that you make sure that all the labeling and all the other requirements are met before you ship, so that you don't run into problems. If you do run into problems, reach out to us. Again, no charge. We can help you figure out what's happening. We can look at the notice. We can advise you what it appears the problem is and how you might rectify it. And then if we have services that can assist, of course, we'd love for you to use our services as well. We take a lot of pride in our FDA expertise, and we absolutely want to share it with industry and ensure that you all have problem-free export to the United States. So thank you. We are out of time. Again, you can send additional questions. If I didn't get to your questions, send it to info@registrarcorp.com. This concludes our presentation. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.